David Sheff wrote the original book on the history of Nintendo, famously known as Game Over, and everyone refers back to it as a foundational book on the subject. Over the years, there have been various covers, subtitles, and versions. Sheff says he even heard it became assigned reading in university business courses and required reading for people entering the games industry. And it does seem to be on the syllabus list of many university classes, as you can see here. Sheff's articles have appeared in Playboy, Rolling Stone, The Observer, Foreign Literature, among other publications, and on National Public Radio's All Things Considered. His book, The Playboy Interviews with John Lennon and Yoko Ono, was a literary guild selection. Sheff decided to write a book on Nintendo and wanted to interview people at the company. The primary version of the book was published in 1993, but it was also updated in 1999. It's free online, and you should look. It's pretty easy to find. I accidentally bought it before I knew that, and so I almost bought it new for like $100, but I still ended up spending like $30 for it used with a big old crease right on the front cover. But it's free online. Nintendo initially refused to cooperate and then chose to open doors once convinced Sheff would write it anyway. Nintendo does not endorse the book, but their corporate communications manager, Perrin Kaplan, said, "We feel it's a fair book." Sheff actually hardly mentions the Yakuza connection that we'll look at in a future video. He was also criticized for downplaying some accusations of racial discrimination leveled at Nintendo, which we'll also look at in a future video. Nintendo gave Sheff near total access, including 8+ hours of interviews with the reclusive Hiroshi Yamauchi. He extensively interviewed numerous established figures in the industry, such as Howard Lincoln, Nolan Bushnell, Shigeru Miyamoto, Alexei Pajitnov, and others, including people who spoke anonymously. He still reports on some negative stories about the company, and it's very likely the book turned Nintendo off from working with other authors who weren't under their thumb. Nintendo likely agreed to work with him so they could air their side of the story concerning the various corporate battles, for example with Atari, that Sheff documents. Sheff writes, "When it was ready to go to press, Nintendo, after originally agreeing to allow Random House to use an image of Mario on the jacket, withdrew its permission. Phone calls between the game company and publishing house were many and furious, but Nintendo refused to reconsider. So the Random House art director hastily constructed an effective cover around a new image, a child staring hypnotically at a glowing TV monitor. The next book that came along was The History of Nintendo, Volume 1, 1889 to 1990, by historian Florent Georges? I'm not sure. It was published in French in 2008 and in English in 2012. He did long, on-the-ground research in Japan, years, not weeks. In an interview about his first History of Nintendo volume, he describes multi-year investigations and the problem of compiling and organizing a huge documentary record. He uses real-world historical materials, not just recycled trivia. He says his photos and documentation came from things like old Kyoto newspaper archives, trade and toy magazines from the 1960s and 70s, interviews, private collections, donations, and purchases, and even notes that some items exist in documents but are now hard to find. Even Nintendo no longer has them. He explains that speaking Japanese and writing for the Japanese Nintendo magazine, Nintendo Dream, Japan's biggest Nintendo magazine, opened doors, and he reports meeting Nintendo people, including Miyamoto, and helping organize a Nintendo museum exhibition in Osaka. He's also a professional translator and editor in Nintendo-adjacent publishing. For example, he translated Zelda-related works, and in France, Hyrule Historia. In his book, The History of Nintendo, Volume 1, he notes that, even in Japan, only a short article in the Kyoto Journal was published, celebrating Nintendo's 120 years of existence. Nintendo lovers might, therefore, regret the management's blatant lack of interest in the company's past. And he also told a reporter, there was a certain culture of secrecy taken to extremes within Nintendo that made it very squeamish about trying new things. The next book is Nintendo Magic: Winning the Video Game Wars by Japanese business and technology reporter Osamu Inao. It was published in Japanese in 2009 and in English in 2010. Inao writes, with Nintendo performing so spectacularly on the world stage, the media worldwide is eager to know their secret, but nearly all have been turned away at the door. That's just the way the company is. Nintendo prefers not to have its management discussed by outsiders, even eschewing praise. As a result, despite the company's success, opportunities for individual interviews are extremely rare, and there are essentially no publications that deal with Nintendo's management. We'll talk about our products as much as you like, but a profile of the company president or a discussion of our management practices and ideals, those have nothing to do with products. Our attention is focused on game hardware and software. We hold thorough investor meetings. There's no point in doing individual interviews. Anytime we have something to say, we'll put it on our website. This would sum up Nintendo's approach to PR. And it's an attitude that's only become entrenched as they've grown to compete with the world's giants. To borrow Iwata's own words, we've had our ideas copied so often that we've gotten really sensitive about it. Nintendo's reluctance to discuss its management can be seen as the proof of how serious the company is about protecting itself from competitors. At the root of that corporate culture is the assumption that even if they were to discuss their management, outsiders wouldn't understand, an eminently Nintendo-like notion. Thus, not seeing any point in such discourses, they practice rigorous information control, consistently keeping exposure to the minimum possible. However, Nikkei Business, my employer, was given the chance to interview at length Nintendo miracle workers like Satoru Iwata and Shigeru Miyamoto, and was fortunate enough to have the pleasure of speaking with Hiroshi Yamauchi, former president of and current advisor to the company. This is the first time he's spoken openly about the management of Nintendo since retiring. They generally avoid interviews for books, especially with Western press. In Japan, Nikkei, the Nihon Keizai Shimbun, is the equivalent of the Wall Street Journal, but with even higher cultural authority. It is the paper of record for Japanese corporations. Nintendo ignores most requests, but they generally cannot ignore Nikkei. For a Kyoto company, speaking to Nikkei is speaking to Japan Inc., not just the media. This is why Inao was able to get access to Yamauchi, Iwata, and Miyamoto when almost no one else could. A Kotaku review of business journalist Daniel Sloan's book, Playing to Win, or Playing to Wean, says Sloan is quick to admit that Nintendo did not cooperate with the writing of this book and that many quotes are secondhand. Daniel Sloan, despite being a credible Reuters journalist, was forced to write Playing to Win entirely from the outside. The book is a compilation of public records, financial reports, and secondary quotes because Nintendo saw no value in letting him in. This is the default state of Nintendo PR. Yves Liz Blanc-Deleuze was the marketing and communications director at Nintendo France from 1988 to 1995. She says, Nintendo was always an incredibly secretive company, even inside its own four walls. It's a well-documented fact, even by Reggie, as we'll see in later videos, that Nintendo teams often work in total isolation from one another. Until a major restructuring in 2015, Nintendo's hardware division, IRD, and software division, EAD, were operationally and physically distinct. While they collaborated on high-level goals, such as designing the N64's analog stick specifically for Super Mario 64, lower-level teams often worked in strict silos. This massive internal wall only came down after Satoru Iwata built a brand new development center in Kyoto to physically force the teams into the same building, leading to a 2015 reorganization that finally merged the hardware and operating system teams together, and the internal and external software teams together. Video game reporter and editor Jeff Ryan wrote a book on the company called Super Mario: How Nintendo Conquered America, and in an interview was asked, "Did you run into any walls trying to connect with Nintendo so you could finish the book?" "I hit a rather gigantic wall," Ryan says. "I had written the first draft of the book and I was going to polish it up. First, I wanted to have some interviews. I wanted to talk to Yamauchi and Miyamoto, who I had interviewed before. But they said that Nintendo does not cooperate with book publishers. They had suggested I lie and say it was for a blog or a newspaper, and then use that article for the book. But I wasn't comfortable with that level of dishonesty." Why is Nintendo so against book publishers specifically? Because a few years ago, a man by the name of David Sheff wrote a very good book called Game Over: How Nintendo Conquered the World. And because it was a very fair book, it diverged from the story they wanted to tell about themselves. Game Over became one of my main resources for writing my own book. In the book, he writes, "Nintendo is a particular company, and one of those particularities is not cooperating with the press when it comes to books. So most all of that access dried up when I told them I was working on something longer than a magazine article. My time spent embedded in the Mushroom Kingdom was thus unofficial.